cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Al-Ghazali frames his argument very simply, I quote, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning." So, once again, we can summarize Al-Ghazali's argument in three simple, easily memorizable steps. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument is so marvelously simple that it's easy to memorize and share with another person. It's also a logically airtight argument. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So, anybody who wants to deny the conclusion has to regard either premise 1 or premise 2 as false. So, the whole question is it more probable that these statements are true or that they are false? Let's examine each premise in turn. I think that the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, is virtually undeniable for any sincere seeker after truth. For something to come into being without any cause whatsoever would be to come into being from nothing. But that is surely impossible. Let me give three reasons in support of this premise. Number one, something cannot come from nothing. To claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But if you deny premise 1, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. This isn't rocket science. In The Sound of Music, when Captain Von Trapp and Maria reveal their love for each other, what does Maria say? Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. Now, we don't normally think of philosophical principles as romantic, but Maria was here expressing a fundamental truth of classical metaphysics. No doubt she had been well trained in classical philosophy at the convent school. Now, sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. Or certain theories of the origin of the universe are sometimes described in popular magazines as getting something from nothing, so that the universe is the exception to the proverb, there ain't no free lunch. This skeptical response represents, I believe, a deliberate abuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles or the universes originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. The vacuum in modern physics is not what laymen understand by vacuum, namely nothing. Rather, in physics, the vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. To tell laymen that on such theories something comes from nothing is a distortion of those theories. And there is, by the way, a lesson in this. You have to be very, very leery of popular articles and television shows on scientific theories. In order to communicate these highly technical theories to laymen, writers inevitably have to resort to metaphors and word pictures that can be grossly misleading and inaccurate. And the claim that physics shows that something can come from nothing is a case in point. Properly understood, nothing does not mean just empty space. Nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever, even space itself. As such, nothingness literally has no properties at all. since there isn't anything to have any properties. How silly then, when popularizers say things like nothingness is unstable to quantum fluctuations, or the universe tunneled into being out of nothing. When I first published my work on the Kalam cosmological argument in 1979, I figured that atheists would attack premise 2 of the argument, that the universe began to exist. But I didn't think that they'd go after premise 1, for that would make them look like people not sincerely seeking after truth, but just looking for an academic refutation of the argument. What a surprise, then, to hear atheists denying premise 1 in order to escape the argument. For example, Quentin Smith of the University of Western Michigan responded that the most rational position to hold is that the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Sort of a good conclusion to a Gettysburg Address of atheism, perhaps. This is simply the faith of an atheist. In fact, I think this represents a greater leap of faith than belief in the existence of God. For it is, I repeat, literally worse than magic. If this is the alternative to belief in God, then unbelievers can never accuse believers of irrationality. For nothing, I think, could be more evidently irrational than this. Number 2, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer just pop into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that can come into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties. Nor can anything constrain nothingness, for there isn't anything to be constrained. I've heard atheists respond to this argument by saying that premise 1 is true of everything in the universe, but not of the universe. But this is just the old taxicab fallacy that we encountered in Leibniz's argument. You can't dismiss the causal principle like a cab once you get to the universe. Premise 1 is not merely a law of nature, like the law of gravity, which only applies in the universe. Rather, it's a metaphysical principle that governs all of being, all of reality. At this point, the atheist is likely to retort, all right, if everything has a cause, what is God's cause? I'm always amazed at the self-congratulatory attitude with which students pose this question. They imagine that they've said something important or profound, when all they've done is misunderstand the premise. Premise 1 does not say that everything has a cause. Rather, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something that is eternal wouldn't need a cause because it never came into being. Al-Ghazali would therefore respond that God is eternal and uncaused. And this is not special pleading for God, since this is exactly what the atheist has traditionally said about the universe. It is eternal and uncaused. The problem is that we have good evidence that the universe is not eternal, but had a beginning. And so the atheist is backed into the corner of saying that the universe sprang into being without a cause, which is absurd. 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is constantly verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how any atheist committed to modern science could deny that premise 1 is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence. So I think that the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is clearly true. If the price of denying the argument's conclusion is denying premise 1, then atheism is, I think, philosophically bankrupt. The more controversial premise in the argument is premise 2, that the universe began to exist. let me present two philosophical arguments and two scientific arguments in defense of this premise. First, the philosophical arguments. Al-Ghazali argued that if the universe never began to exist, then there have been an infinite number of past events prior to today. But, he argued, an infinite number of things cannot exist. Al-Ghazali recognized that a potentially infinite number of things could exist, but he denied that an actually infinite number of things could exist. Let me explain the difference. When we say that something is potentially infinite, infinity serves merely as an ideal limit which is never reached. For example, you could divide any finite distance in half, and then into fourths, and then into eighths, and then into sixteenths, and so on to infinity. The number of divisions is potentially infinite, and in that sense you could keep on dividing endlessly. But you would never arrive at an infinity F division. You would never have an actually infinite number of parts or divisions. Now, Al-Ghazali has no problem with the existence of a potentially infinite number of things, for these are just ideal limits. But he argued that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. If we're to avoid these absurdities, then we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exist. And that would mean that the number of past events cannot be actually infinite, and therefore the universe cannot be beginningless. Rather, the universe began to exist. Now, it's very frequently alleged that this kind of argument has been invalidated by developments in modern mathematics. In modern set theory, the use of actually infinite sets is commonplace. For example, the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, is actually infinite. It is not merely potentially infinite, according to modern set theory. Rather, the number of members in this set is actually infinite. There are an actually infinite number of natural numbers. And many people have mistakenly inferred that these mathematical developments undermine Al-Ghazali's argument. But these developments in modern mathematics merely showed that if you adopt certain axioms and conventions, then you can talk about actually infinite collections in a consistent way without contradicting yourself. All this accomplishes is showing how to set up a certain universe of discourse for talking consistently about actual infinites. But it does absolutely nothing to show that the mathematical entities really exist, or that an actually infinite number of things can really exist. If Al-Ghazali is right, then this universe of discourse can be regarded as just a fictional realm, like the world of Sherlock Holmes, or something that exists only in your mind. Moreover, Al-Ghazali's claim is not that the existence of an actually infinite number of things involves a logical contradiction, but that it is really impossible. To give an analogy, the claim that something came into existence out of nothing, uncaused, is not strictly logically contradictory, but nevertheless it is really impossible. These modern mathematical developments, far from undermining Al-Ghazali's argument, can actually strengthen it by providing us insight into the strange nature of the actual infinite. The way in which Al-Ghazali brings out the real impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences. Let me share one of my favorite illustrations called Hilbert's Hotel, after the great German mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert first invites us to imagine an ordinary hotel with a finite number of rooms. Suppose, furthermore, that all the rooms are occupied. If a new guest shows up at the desk,